verse 542. If beings themselves are not, and yet they become the cause of transmigration, then there will be an emancipation which is independent of people's strivings. The previous verses and the next few are about the non-existence of beings. I get the impression something's being pursued here, both logically and, for want of a better word, spiritually. We are knocking at the door here of liberation. These verses are almost pushing us through that door. The key thing in enlightenment practice is to move away from our ideas about reality to what actually is. And you might think, well, I don't have any ideas about reality. I'm very much in the moment. Well, this is something that needs to be examined, because we do have ideas. Our ideas, even if we're not actively acting on them, they determine our basic bearing, our basic affectations in response to being alive. We have a certain bearing, a certain stance, certain attitudes with respect to the situation that we find ourselves in. And this is what we need to examine. This is technically our samskara, our psychological predisposition. But to get to the point, one of the ideas we've got about reality is that we have a body, and that there are other bodies walking around. So you see what I mean about ideas in reality. You might take that as perfectly real, and that maybe I've got a screw loose in questioning this. Although, in my own defense, I'm just taking my cue here from the texts. So we've been looking at this understanding in the previous few verses. And if you just jumped into this video, then it might be good to backtrack 2 or 3 verses, 2 or 3 videos. Back in verse 537, the notion of karma was knocked on the head. Karma could be a useful way of thinking in some ways. So I see it as a poetic understanding. You shouldn't try and make these into some kind of physical reality. But the side effect of notions of karma is reinforcing the idea of an individual that takes responsibility for their own individual existence, an individual that acts, that behaves in certain ways, and consequences are fed back onto that individual. So if there are no individual beings, there can be no karma. This is what was explored. And with karma come the understanding that there are defilements, behaviour based on ignorance. This too has to go. This was explored in the previous videos. So this verse 542 is saying, if beings themselves are not, and yet they become the cause of transmigration. Transmigration is normally understood as reincarnation, a new birth after a previous death. But what actually transmigrates when we get down to it? What is transmigrating right now? If you're not practicing. If you're not practicing, then what is transmigrating is the attention. When the attention is at rest in itself, we have pure awareness. The attention, when it's at rest, is pure consciousness. It's the nature of consciousness. It's the nature of consciousness, though, to go out of itself, to transmigrate. It's the nature of the attention to go out of itself, to find things to attend to. It's all perfectly natural. But this becomes a habit. Transmigration becomes a habit. This attention is an extraordinary thing. It can go anywhere. Anywhere in the so-called physical world. Anywhere in the imagination. Anywhere in the so-called body. We can put the attention anywhere. How extraordinary. But this is transmigration. And when consciousness gets lost in this, we get the notion of a body and of an external world. But at some point, the attention comes back to itself. And this is spontaneous. There is nothing that you can do to encourage this. It either happens or it doesn't. And it must happen just as day follows night. Just as wakefulness follows sleep. At some point, the attention comes back to itself. Because the attention is this. It's simply what it sounds like. It's a tension. It's like an elastic band that is constantly pulling itself out. Now and again, it comes back. It must do. And when it does, this is emancipation. This is the emancipation which is independent of people's strivings. It's sometimes referred to as spontaneous enlightenment. The trick, though, the role that you have to play is to recognize this, is to recognize it. Stop putting your attention onto this video. Stop putting it onto the sounds that you're hearing. Allow the arrow of your attention to snap back. Come back to stillness. It's very still. When this attention comes back to itself, there is such stillness, even though there might be noise going on. I think you know this, don't you? You know this. Perhaps you don't properly appreciate it. Perhaps you do. Because once there's been this spontaneous emancipation, then we can keep coming back to it, or we can make space for it to happen more and more and more. So this is the point. So this is the point, and it's reflected in the story of the Buddha's own enlightenment. And I've spoken about this in the past, about how when the Buddha, on the evening of his enlightenment, when he sat down, the first thing he did was, after collecting himself by going through meditative absorptions, he remembered the time as a teenager when he had this spontaneous emancipation, and he came back to it and took it from there. So this is what you do. You don't simply remember it, you realize it afresh. And you can do that by turning the arrow of attention, the arrow of the attention, back on itself. And all these abstract notions or philosophical notions become direct realization of awareness. They become awareness itself.